The knock came at 6:40 in the morning. Three heavy strikes against the door of apartment 2B at the Meridian Arms Complex in Columbus, Ohio. Not a polite knock, not the kind a neighbor makes when they want to borrow something. The kind that means business has arrived and does not intend to wait on the porch. Harriet Holloway was already awake. She had been sitting at her kitchen table since 5, the way she had sat at kitchen tables for most of her adult life, in the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to waste the quiet hours before the world starts demanding things. Her tea had gone cold. She had not noticed. She was reading a letter from Fairfield County Hospital, place where she had spent 31 years of her life, and the letter was informing her in the careful language of institutional bureaucracy that her pension benefit would be reduced by an additional 12%, effective the first of the following month, citing as these letters always do necessary budgetary adjustments to sustain long-term system viability. She had read it 3 times already, not because she did not understand it. She understood it perfectly. She was reading it again because she was trying to locate somewhere inside herself a feeling of surprise, and she could not find one. She set the letter down when the knock came. The hallway was dim at that hour. The overhead fixture at the end of the corridor burned out for the 3rd month in a row without anyone fixing it. She opened the door, and a man in a gray jacket stood there holding a clipboard, not making eye contact the way people do when they are doing something they would prefer not to think about too carefully. He said good morning in a tone that suggested he knew the morning was not going to be good. Then he turned and walked away, and when he did, a folded piece of paper fluttered from the door frame where it had been nailed, or rather where a nail had been driven through it, directly into the wood of the frame, and the paper fell and landed on the worn carpet of the hallway floor. Harriet bent down slowly to pick it up. Her knees made their usual complaints. She stood back up and unfolded the paper and read it in the gray light coming through the window at the end of the hall. 30 days. That was all the Meridian Property Group LLC was giving her. The building had been sold to a developer. Every unit would be converted. The month-to-month lease she had held for 4 years had become, in the language of the notice, an untenable arrangement, and they were offering her, out of what the letter described as courtesy, 30 days to make other arrangements. There was no phone number printed anywhere on the notice. She checked twice. Harriet folded the paper along its existing crease lines, the way she had always folded important documents, the way a person folds things when they know the paper matters, even if what it says is terrible. She tucked it into the pocket of her housecoat and walked back into her apartment and stood in the kitchen for a longer moment, looking at the 2 pieces of paper on her table. The hospital letter and the eviction notice side by side in the kitchen, where she had eaten most of her meals alone for the past several years. Then she opened the drawer beside the stove and counted the money inside. $340. That was what she had in cash. Her bank account held a little more than that, enough to cover the electric bill she had been putting off, but not enough for a deposit on a new apartment, not in this city, not anywhere near this city, not anywhere that made any practical sense for a 72-year-old woman with a reduced pension and no family willing to answer the phone. She closed the drawer. On the small table beside her bed, there was a photograph of Harlan Holloway. He had been a broad-shouldered, quietly cheerful man who worked for the county roads department and coached Little League on Saturday mornings and made the best pot of coffee Harriet had ever tasted in her life. He had died in 1994, a Tuesday in March, right there at the breakfast table, a heart attack that arrived without any warning at all. No symptoms, no buildup, just a Tuesday morning, and then the rest of her life rearranged in the span of a single hour. She had been 44 years old. She had raised 2 children after that, mostly by herself. She had worked the double shifts in the holiday rotations and the weekend hours that nobody else on the floor wanted, and she had done it. Because the alternative was not an option, she allowed herself to consider. You got up, you went in, you did the work. That was the entire philosophy distilled down to its essential components, and it had served her for 31 years. It was not serving her this particular morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph of Harlan for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in years. She opened the drawer of the bedside table, the one she rarely opened anymore, and she looked at what was inside. A small notebook, a few expired medical cards, a pen that no longer worked, and at the back of the drawer, wrapped loosely in a square of old flannel cloth, a ring of keys. Most of them she recognized. One of them she had not touched in decades. It was an old iron key, the kind that looks almost comically heavy and serious, the kind you see in old photographs of people standing in front of old houses. It had gone slightly blue-green with age along the shaft. At the bow, the curved top, someone had scratched two initials into the metal. W.A. Winifred Ashford. Harriet's grandmother, dead since 1978. The woman who had owned a cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee in a small town called Harlan Fork in the Appalachian foothills, where Harriet had spent every summer of her childhood until she was 11 years old, and where she had not been since. She picked the key up and held it in her palm. It was heavier than she remembered, or perhaps she was remembering wrong, the way you always remember things from childhood, as slightly lighter, slightly brighter, slightly more manageable than they actually were. The metal was cold against her skin. This was not the first time she had opened that drawer in a moment of desperation. In 2008, when Broderick had called her from a hospital emergency room without health insurance, and she did not know how she was going to pay the bill, she had sat in this same spot and looked at this same key. Then she had closed the drawer, driven to a pawn shop on Maple Avenue, and placed her wedding ring on the glass counter. The man had given her $400 for it. She had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes afterward because her hands would not stop shaking, and then she had driven home and paid the bill and never spoken about it to anyone. She had chosen a different way that time. Every other time, this time there was no different way left. She had not been back to Harlan Fork since 1963, 61 years. She'd been told when Winifred died that the property was complicated. Her mother had refused to claim it outright. Her mother had said the cabin was cursed, had said things happened there after dark that she could not explain and did not intend to try, had said that nobody who stayed in that place too long ever came back quite right. Harriet had always believed her mother simply did not want the burden of maintaining a rural property 6 hours from Columbus. But the key had stayed in the drawer. She had moved 4 times since 1978, and the key had come with her every time without her making a conscious decision to keep it. She set it on the nightstand beside Harlan's photograph and went to make fresh tea. She did not call Broderick. She had not spoken to her son in 4 years, not since the afternoon he had said, with a flatness in his voice that she still thought about sometimes, that she needed to stop calling him for help and learn to manage on her own. Those had been his exact words. She had replayed them often enough that they had worn smooth in her memory the way a stone wears smooth in a riverbed. Her daughter Rosemary sent a Christmas card every year. Always a nice card, always unsigned beyond her name, never with a return address or a phone number. Harriet kept them in a shoebox in the closet. She was not sure why. She packed 3 cardboard boxes that afternoon. Clothes, a few things from the kitchen, the cast iron skillet and the good knife and the coffee press. The photo albums. She stood in the living room for a while looking at the album on top of the stack, and she thought about opening it, but she did not. She knew what was inside. She had spent a long time looking at those pictures over the past few years alone in the evenings, and she had decided somewhere along the way that looking at them too often was a habit that did not serve her. She was loading the last box into the trunk of her Buick when she heard the door to apartment 2D open above her on the landing. Gertrude Radford appeared at the top of the stairs in a blue housecoat holding a paper bag. Gertrude was 80 years old and had lived in that building for 11 years and had spent 32 of the years before that teaching fourth grade at an elementary school in the west end of Columbus. She was a small, deliberate woman who chose her words the way a careful person selects fruit at a market, turning each one over before committing to it. She came down the stairs and held out the bag. "Bread and cheese," she said, "for the road." Harriet took it. "Thank you, Gertrude." Gertrude looked at the loaded car. She did not ask where Harriet was going. She did not offer advice about storage units or short-term rentals or children who should step up and help their mothers. She stood on the walkway in the early morning light and said, "You know, in 4 years of living next to you, I've never once seen you look comfortable here." Harriet paused with her hand on the car door. "What do you mean by that?" "Some people live in a place and they belong there. And some people live in a place and they're really somewhere else the whole time they just haven't gotten around to going yet." Gertrude adjusted the collar of her housecoat. "I always thought you were the second kind." Harriet looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the Buick and the 3 boxes in the trunk and the gray Columbus morning spreading out in every direction around them. "I'll let you know how it goes," she said. Gertrude nodded. "You do that." Harriet got in the car and drove south. The drive was 7 hours. She had looked it up on her phone the night before, typed in Harlan Fork, Tennessee, and studied the route the way she used to study a patient chart before a difficult procedure, looking for the complications, planning for what could go wrong. She stopped once at a gas station in Kentucky because her hands had started trembling on the wheel, the particular fine trembling that comes not from cold, but from sustained tension held too long without release. She pulled into the parking lot of a small Baptist church just past the state line and turned off the engine and sat with her eyes closed and breathed the way she had learned to breathe in 31 years of hospital work, slow and deliberate, and from the bottom of the lungs until the trembling stopped. Then she started the car again and kept going. The scar tissue of the landscape changed as she moved south and east. The flat Midwest giving way to rolling country, the rolling country lifting into low ridges, the ridges building into proper mountains, green and dense and old, the kind of old that does not have anything to prove. The fog came in during the last 2 hours, the low Appalachian fog that settles into the hollows and stays there regardless of what the weather is doing on the ridgelines above. And she drove through it slowly, following the white line at the edge of the road, the way you follow a handrail in the dark. Harlan Fork was not what she remembered. She had expected that, had told herself she expected it, but expectation and reality are different things, and the difference hit her with a particular weight when she turned off the state highway and onto the gravel road that led into town. The gas station at the edge of town was boarded shut. Someone had wrapped the old pump islands in vines so thoroughly that only the metal frames showed through, skeletal, beneath the green. A row of houses along the main road had collapsed porches and dark windows and yards that had gone back to meadow. The general store, she remembered the one with the screen door that made a particular slap behind you when it closed, was gone, not closed, not abandoned, simply gone. The lot where it had stood, now occupied by a rectangle of weeds and a concrete pad. The white clapboard church still stood at the end of the road, but the bell tower was empty, the front doors chained with a padlock the size of a man's fist. She drove past it all, slowly watching it through the windshield, and then she continued up the road past the center of town, past a narrow creek running brown and clear over flat stones, and up a dirt track that climbed into the hills. The Buick's suspension complained at every rut. Branches scraped both sides of the car with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. She kept going. She almost missed Norwood's Feed and Supply. It was the only building on the road that still showed light in its windows, a low, broad structure with a hand-painted sign above the door and a covered porch along the front, where three metal chairs had been arranged with the precision of a man who spends time on his porch and cares about where things go. She stopped and went in because she needed to know if the dirt track up the mountain was still passable for a sedan, and because the alternative was driving into the unknown without asking, which was never a strategy she had favored. The man behind the counter was tall and thin, with white hair thick as a brush, and the kind of hands you get from 40 years of outdoor work. The knuckles enlarged, the skin rough and deeply lined, the grip still strong. His eyes were a pale blue that caught the overhead light in a way that made him look like he was always paying closer attention than you realized. He was arranging cans on a shelf when she walked in, and he turned and looked at her, the way people in small places look at someone they don't recognize, which is to say with a directness that city people sometimes mistake for rudeness, but is actually just efficiency. "Help you," he said. "I'm looking for the road up to the Ashford property," Harriet said. "The old cabin on the ridge. I need to know if a sedan can make it." The man's hands stopped moving. He set the can down on the shelf and turned to face her fully. "Who are you?" he asked. Not unfriendly, but not casual either. The question of a man who has a reason for asking. "Harriet Holloway, Winifred Ashford was my grandmother." Something shifted at his face when she said the name. Not quite recognition, because he had clearly already recognized that she was asking about something specific. It was closer to what you see on a person's face when they have been holding a thing carefully for a long time, and someone finally comes to take it from them. "Roscoe Norwood," he said. He did not offer his hand, but the way he said his own name was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I knew Winifred." "Then you know the property." "I do." He picked the can back up and turned it in his hands without putting it on the shelf. "Road's rough, worse than it used to be. That third switchback, she's bad. Sedan might not clear it. I'll manage." He looked at her steadily. "About 3 months ago, a man came through here asking the same question. Truck 45 or so, asked me how to get to the Ashford cabin." Harriet felt something tighten in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. Winifred told me once years ago that if anyone came asking about that property and they didn't know her by her given name, just called it the Ashford cabin, like it was a landmark, I should keep my mouth shut." He set the can down again. "That man didn't know her name." "But you told me." "You knew her name," Roscoe said, "and you've got her eyes." There was a silence between them, then the kind that happens in small rooms when something true has been said out loud. Harriet looked at him. "I may need a witness," she said. "Someone who can confirm I came here today and went up to that property. There are people who may try to say otherwise." Roscoe's expression did not change. He reached under the counter and brought out a small receipt book, the old kind, with carbon paper. He wrote something in it, tore off the top copy, and held it out to her. She took it. It was a note dated with that day's date in a handwriting that was precise and unhurried. "Harriet Holloway, granddaughter of Winifred Ashford, came to Norwood's Feed and Supply on this date and inquired about access to the Ashford property on the ridge. She was advised of road conditions and proceeded up the mountain." "That'll do as a start," he said. "But I'll tell you something. If it comes to it, I'll say what I saw in person, to whoever needs to hear it." She looked at the note for a moment. "Why?" "Because Winifred Ashford lent me money in 1975 when my harvest failed, and my wife left, and I was drinking on the porch at 10 in the morning. He said it without drama, the way a man states a fact that he has long since made his peace with. She sat down next to me and asked me what I actually wanted out of my life, not what I needed to buy or pay off. What I wanted. Nobody had ever asked me that question before. I told her I wanted this farm to survive. She went home and came back with enough money to get me through to the next season. No interest, no conditions. She just said, pay me back when you have it. Did you? Paid her back in 1977. He picked the can up one final time and placed it on the shelf. That road gets real narrow past the second curve. Keep your tires to the left. The road did get narrow. It got narrow in a way that made the word narrow feel inadequate. A single-lane track carved into the side of a mountain by someone who had cared more about getting there than about the comfort of the journey. The Buick scraped rock twice at the second curve, not badly, but enough to make her grip the wheel tighter. Branches dragged across the roof. At the third switchback, she had to reverse twice and then angle the nose of the car at a precise degree that she arrived at by instinct rather than calculation, the way you arrive at most things when you have driven long enough that your hands know things your brain hasn't articulated yet. She got through. The road ended in a flat clearing, a small natural platform in the mountainside, where the trees had been cut back long ago and had not grown back in the same way, leaving an open space that felt deliberate even now. She turned off the engine. Through a tangle of brush and deadfall timber in the fading afternoon light that was turning golden and low, she could see it. The cabin, still standing. She sat in the car for a moment without moving. She had been bracing herself in the back of her mind for ruins. 46 years of Tennessee mountain weather, with no one to maintain a structure, was by any reasonable estimate enough to reduce even solid construction to a foundation and scattered boards. She had told herself she was prepared for that. She had told herself it would be okay. There might still be land value, she had thought, mineral rights, something. She pushed out of the car and through the brush with her arms raised to protect her face. Thorns caught at the sleeve of her jacket and tore a hole near the cuff. Her shoes went down into black mud that had not seen direct sunlight in years. She kept moving. When she reached the front of the cabin, she stopped. The porch had been swept, not recently swept, not swept this week, but maintained, cared for, kept clear over a period of time that suggested ongoing attention rather than a single preparation. No cobwebs hung from the door frame. No dead leaves had piled against the threshold. The wood of the porch boards looked worn, but intact, the way old good wood looks when it has been protected from the worst of what weather can do. She put her hand on the door handle and turned it. The door opened without a sound. What was inside the cabin made her take one involuntary step backward and grip the door frame with both hands to stay upright. The floor had been swept and polished to a low shine, not a gleam, not a waxed brightness, but the particular glow of old wood that has been cleaned regularly and with care. In the stone fireplace on the far wall, a fire was burning. Not a low bed of coals that might have been burning for days. A real fire, fed recently, the kind that someone had added wood to within the past hour at most. On the kitchen table, a glass of water sat with condensation still forming on its outside surface, small droplets of moisture making their slow way down toward the wooden table. Beside it, a loaf of bread on a cutting board. She crossed the room and pressed her fingertips to the top of the bread. Warm. She pulled her hand back. She went through both rooms of the cabin with her heart knocking against the inside of her chest. The back bedroom had a bed made up with white sheets, corners tucked with a precision she recognized from somewhere deep in her childhood. The pillows were centered and fluffed. In the main room, a wooden rocking chair sat beside the hearth, and draped over one arm was a hand-stitched quilt folded with a particular neatness that she did not think she had seen anywhere since she was a small girl spending summers in these mountains. Winifred had folded things that way. folded them as though the act of doing it correctly was a form of respect. She checked the back door, locked from the inside. She checked every window, closed and latched. There were no footprints on the swept floor except the ones she had just made with her own muddy shoes. She turned back to the kitchen table, and that was when she saw it. Sitting on the table beside the glass of water, placed with the same deliberate precision as everything else in the room, was a leather-bound journal. Old. The cover worn to a softness that comes from decades of handling. A leather strap wrapped around it and buckled shut. Harriet sat down at the chair at the table. Her hands were not entirely steady as she undid the buckle and opened the cover. The handwriting stopped everything. She knew that handwriting in the way you know the sound of a voice you have loved for a long time. The particular loop at the base of each capital L, the long, slightly diagonal crossbar on every T, the way the letters tilted forward with a gentle consistency, as though they were all leaning towards something they were eager to reach. Winifred Ashford's handwriting, letter for letter, stroke for stroke, not an imitation, not something that resembled it, the actual hand. Harriet's eyes moved to the upper corner of the first page where the date was written in that same familiar script. She looked at it for a long time. 3 days ago. The journal had been written 3 days ago. She sat in Winifred Ashford's cabin in Winifred Ashford's rocking chair with a fire burning in Winifred Ashford's fireplace, holding a journal written in Winifred Ashford's hand dated 3 days before the morning she had received the eviction notice. 46 years after the woman who wrote it had died. Outside, the mountain was going quiet in the way mountains go quiet at the end of a day. The birds settling the wind, dropping the enormous stillness of elevation and old growth, pressing in from all sides. Harriet placed both hands flat on the open journal, feeling the texture of the old paper beneath her palms. Then she began to read. The first entry was dated a Tuesday. Not this Tuesday. Not any Tuesday in the recent past. Winifred Ashford had begun this particular journal entry the way she began most things in her life, without preamble, without ceremony, with the directness of a woman who had decided long ago that time was too valuable to spend on wind-up. She wrote the date, she wrote the place, and then she began. Harriet read by firelight. The lamp on the kitchen table cast a steadier glow. But the fire was what she wanted, the familiar yellow warmth of it, moving across the old plank walls, the way firelight has moved across walls in mountain cabins since before anyone alive could remember. Outside, Harlan Fork was fully dark. The mountains went dark the way they always had, completely and without apology. No street lights, no ambient glow from nearby cities, just the particular blackness of elevation and old-growth forest closing in from every direction. She read slowly. Winifred wrote about a Tuesday in August of 1961. A storm had come through the week before and taken a section of the roof above the storage loft, and Winifred had spent 3 days patching it herself the way she did everything that needed doing, without calling anyone, without complaining, without any of the theater that surrounds physical difficulty when people want to be seen enduring it. When the patch was done, she had gone up into the loft to check her work and to move the boxes that had gotten wet back against the dry wall, and that was when she had found it. A tin box, the kind that once held tobacco or tea heavy gauge, sealed with a strip of black rubber that had dried and cracked but still held. On the lid, scratched in by hand with something narrow and sharp, were 2 initials, E.A. Ezekiel Ashford, Winifred's grandfather, dead since 1948. A man Harriet had heard mentioned exactly twice in her childhood, each time in the tone adults use when they're referring to something that is both important and closed to further discussion. Winifred had opened the box on the loft floor with the August heat pressing down through the newly patched roof and the smell of wet wood and old paper rising around her. Inside, she found 3 things. A folded sheaf of legal documents, A card with an address on Briar Street in Asheville, North Carolina. The letterhead reading, Tilden and Associates Attorneys at Law, established 1901. And a letter in Ezekiel's own hand, 4 pages of it, written in the cramped and urgent script of a man who knows he will not be saying this again. Harriet turned the page and found Winifred's summary of that letter written in her own voice, as though she had absorbed it so completely that it had become part of her own thinking. Ezekiel Ashford had made his money the way most men made money in the Appalachian coalfields in the early part of the 20th century, by being in the right place when the seams were found and being sharp enough to hold on to his position through the years when the operators tried to cut everyone out. He had been neither cruel nor sentimental about it. He had simply paid attention and made decisions, and accumulated over 30 years of coal country work, a substantial amount of money, and a set of mineral and timber rights in several hundred acres of mountain land that continued to produce royalty income long after the coal operators had moved on to other mountains. But the money had done what money does when it is concentrated and visible, and the people who want it are people who share a name. Ezekiel had 2 brothers, and when the extent of his assets became known, the thing that had been a family became a legal proceeding. By the time the courts were done, the brothers were strangers. 2 of them moved away and never returned. A cousin changed his name. Ezekiel watched it happen from the inside, and he did not forgive himself for it, not because he believed he had done something wrong in making the money, but because he had made it visible too soon to the wrong people, without understanding what visibility does to the human capacity for wanting more than you have. He had spent the last years of his life building a structure around what remained of the wealth so that it could not be seen. Not hidden in the crude sense, not buried under a floorboard. Hidden in the legal sense, in the only place that can hold something without revealing it, inside a trust administered by people with no personal stake in the outcome. The document he left in the box was the founding instrument of the Ezekiel Ashford Family Trust, established in 1932, administered by Tilden and Associates of Asheville, North Carolina. The assets included mineral rights on 47 acres surrounding the cabin property, an active timber lease with a regional lumber operation, and a cash account at a Knoxville bank that had been compounding in careful silence for 29 years by the time Winifred found the box. Winifred had climbed down from that loft, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat at this same table in this same kitchen and read every page of every document twice through. Then she had put it all back in the tin box and gone out to the garden and worked in it for an hour without thinking, the way she always processed things that needed processing through her hands and through the soil. Then she came back inside and made her decision. She would tell no one. Harriet had to stop reading at that point, not because the words were hard to understand, because they were too easy. She understood exactly what Winifred had decided and exactly why, and she sat with the journal in her lap and looked at the fire for a long time. Winifred had spent the summers of Harriet's childhood teaching her to name every tree on the ridge: white oak, shagbark hickory, black walnut. She had taught her how to read the weather by the way light moved through the upper canopy, and how to tell where water ran underground by the way certain plants clustered near the surface. She had taken her along paths that she said the land itself had made over centuries of use, deer trails widened by generations of human passage. And she had pointed at outcroppings of rock along the hillside and said in the particular voice she used when she wanted something to stick, "This mountain knows how to keep a secret." Harriet had understood that as something about nature, about geology, about the long, quiet patience of stone. She was understanding it differently now. Winifred continued in the journal. She had contacted the Tilden office. She had driven to Asheville and met with Harold Tilden, the son of the man who had originally drafted the trust documents for Ezekiel, and she had explained what she wanted. Harold Tilden had been, by Winifred's account, a careful and patient man who asked good questions and wrote everything down. He had not tried to talk her out of anything. He had simply asked her to be precise about the conditions she was setting, and she had been. The trust would continue to grow. The mineral and timber income would be added to the principal annually. The account would not be touched. And when the time came when the right person arrived at this cabin with genuine need and nothing else, the trust would be transferred to that person in full, along with the property and all associated rights. The right person, Winifred had written, would not be identified by birth order or by gender or by any of the usual ways families determine who deserves what. The right person would be the one who had been knocked down far enough to need this and who had still found their way here on their own, without being told, without being guided, without any advantage except the memory of this place and whatever stubbornness God had given them. Harriet looked up from the page. The fire had burned down somewhat. She added a piece of wood from the pile beside the hearth without thinking about it, the way you perform a task that your hands already know how to do. She sat back down and turned to the next page and found the list. It was presented simply, Winifred's handwriting, no introduction, no explanation. Just names and numbers arranged in two neat columns. Broderick Holloway, $312,000. Rosemary Holloway Radford, $275,000. Landon Ashford Jr., $487,000. And below those three, written in slightly smaller letters, as though the pen had applied less pressure, another name she had to read twice before it registered. Arabella Radford, $94,000. Harriet did not put the journal down. She did not stand up. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the short pencil she always carried in the habit of 31 years of making notes on charts, and she opened to the inside cover of the journal where there was a blank half page, and she wrote the four numbers down and added them. $1,168,000. She underlined the total. Then she sat with the pencil in her hand and looked at what she had written. Broderick. She had called him in the fall of 2019 because she was short on the electric bill and did not want to ask, but the alternative was no heat in November. He had wired her $300 and called back 2 days later to say he needed it back by the end of the month, which she managed by skipping 2 weeks of groceries and withdrawing from the small savings account she had been building for 4 years. 6 months after that, he had told her to stop calling him. Rosemary had not responded to her last 3 letters. Not ignored them, not written back to say she was busy, simply had not responded the way you do not respond to something you have decided to pretend you did not receive. Landon Ashford Jr., she had met once at Winifred's funeral in 1978, a man in an expensive suit standing slightly apart from the rest of the family with the expression of someone performing grief for an audience. He had told her mother that the property situation would be complicated and then gone back to Charlotte. Arabella Radford. She had met at Rosemary's wedding in 2009. She could see her now clearly standing close beside Rosemary throughout the reception, leaning in to say things in a low voice, looking at Harriet across the room with an expression that Harriet had been unable to name at the time. She could name it now. It was the expression of a person who knows something you do not and is calculating whether that asymmetry is useful to them. Winifred's journal had a second note beneath the list of names written in noticeably smaller letters. The ink, a slightly different shade, added at a different time than the surrounding text. Arabella found the Tilden office before Broderick and Rosemary knew the trust existed. She is a commercial attorney who specializes in trust law. She spent 18 months building the legal argument that converted the emergency disbursement clause into a recurring withdrawal mechanism. Landon signs because Landon receives 15% of every disbursement. He has been doing this for 12 years. Harriet read that paragraph and then read it again. She stood up and walked to the fireplace and stood in front of it with both hands resting on the stone mantle. The stone was cold. Mountain stone holds cold the way it holds everything deeply and without complaint, regardless of what burns on the other side. She stood there until the information inside her had arranged itself into something she could carry without dropping. 12 years. The withdrawals had been running for 12 years, which meant they had started in 2012, 2 years after Arabella had married into the family, 1 year after Arabella had apparently identified the trust's existence. Harriet had been working at the hospital until 2016, double shifts on holidays, extra weekend rotations. She had retired at 68 because her body had finally submitted a bill for what she had spent, and the pension had been enough barely if she was careful. And she had been careful. She had been so careful for so long that careful had stopped feeling like a choice and had become simply the texture of her life. She walked back to the table and picked up the journal and kept reading. Winifred had known the emergency disbursement clause could be exploited. She had written about it plainly. The original trust document contained the clause because Harold Tilden had insisted on it as a practical necessity. Families run into genuine emergencies. A completely inflexible instrument was, in Harold's view, a liability. Winifred had accepted the clause and then spent years worrying about it, and finally in 1978, in the weeks before she died, she had done something about it. She had added a secondary account to the trust structure, a protected sub-account entirely separate from the main trust funded by all mineral and timber royalties generated from the property. This account could not be accessed through the emergency disbursement clause. It could not be accessed by Landon as trustee. It could not be reached by anyone operating through the legal mechanisms that Arabella had eventually found and weaponized. It was insulated from everything except a direct claim by the primary beneficiary made in person at the offices of Tilden and Associates. For 10 years, Adrian Tilden had been sending letters to this cabin. Letters to Harriet at this address because Winifred had included Harriet's name in the sub-account documents as the designated recipient of all correspondence regarding the trust. Someone had been intercepting those letters. Harriet set the journal down on the table. She did not slam it. She placed it down carefully. Then she pressed her palms flat against the tabletop and leaned her weight into them and breathed. She thought about the text message that had come at 2 in the morning 3 days ago. Do not go to Harlan Fork. She had assumed it was sent to frighten her. She understood now that it had been sent in panic. Whoever sent it knew she was coming, which meant they had known about the eviction before she did, or they had known she would have nowhere left to go, and they had known that this cabin was the only place she might turn. They had known all of it. They had been watching the edges of her life for years, making sure the pressure stayed high enough to keep her from having any margin to think or investigate or ask questions. And they had miscalculated by exactly one thing. They had not known she still had the key. She was so deep in thought that she nearly missed the moment when her eyes grew too heavy to hold open. The fire had dropped again. The room was warm and still. At some point, without deciding to, she let her head rest against the back of the rocking chair, and the journal slid to her lap, and she slept. She did not dream. She never dreamed when she was exhausted enough. There was simply darkness, and then something pulled her up through it. A sound, a single page turning. Harriet's eyes came open fast the way they used to at the hospital when a monitor changed pitch at 3 in the morning. Full alertness, no transition, the way you wake up when your nervous system already knows something is wrong before your conscious mind has caught up. The fire had burned down to scattered coals. The lamp still burned, but the room had darkened around it. She sat up in the rocking chair and looked at the kitchen table. The journal was still there, but it was open, not to the page where she had stopped reading. She could see that clearly from across the room. It was open to a page further along, a page she had not yet reached. She got up and crossed to it. Two lines of Winifred's handwriting, the ink dark and clear, the letters precise as they had always been. "They know you are here. Do not let them in." Harriet's pulse went from resting to full speed without any intermediate step. She turned to the next page. More writing, a different kind of list, this time not numbers but information, arranged in the same careful columns. Broderick Holloway, informed of the trust in 2011. Source, Arabella Radford. Rosemary Holloway Radford, informed in 2012. Initially objected, subsequently agreed to participate. Landon Ashford Jr. contacted Arabella Radford in 2009. Provided her with copies of the original trust documents. Arabella Radford identified the trust independently in 2010 through property records and Tilden office filings. And below that, a single line underlined once. "They left home yesterday evening. You have until morning." Harriet looked at their clock on the wall. It was a simple wooden clock, the kind that has to be wound by hand, and it was still running, which meant someone had been winding it. The hands showed 8:47. Then just beneath the ambiance of the mountain quiet, she heard it. An engine, distant, low, moving uphill. She was across the room and at the lamp before she finished the thought, turning the key to cut the light, plunging the cabin into the near-complete darkness, broken only by the glow of the dying fire. She went to the window and stood at the edge of it, back against the wall, and watched. Headlights appeared through the trees below, moving slowly up the grade, the beams sweeping across trunks and brush as the vehicle navigated the switchbacks. A large vehicle. The headlights were high and wide set. The truck came into the clearing and stopped. The engine went quiet. A door opened. She could hear the boots on the gravel before she heard the voice. And then the voice carrying up through the night air to the thin walls of the cabin, clear and low and careful, in the particular tone of a man who has prepared what he is going to say. "Mom." She had not heard her son's voice in 4 years. She had thought on some days that she had forgotten what it sounded like. She had not. It was exactly as she remembered it, that practiced, careful cadence, the voice he used when he wanted something and intended to manage the conversation toward getting it. She had heard every version of it across 48 years of knowing him. She recognized this one immediately. She did not move from the wall. He came up the porch steps. She heard each board take his weight. Then the knock, 2 measured strikes. "Mom, I know you're in there. I saw your car at the bottom of the hill." She said nothing. "Please, we need to talk." She heard the word "we" land in the room with her like a stone dropped from height. She moved to stand with her back against the wall beside the door and spoke through the wood, her voice low and flat. "How long have you known about the trust, Broderick?" The silence on the other side of the door was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a man who has just watched the ground he was standing on disappear. Before he could answer, she heard a second engine, smaller, faster on the grade. Headlights swept the clearing again. A car door, and then heels on stone, a quick, precise sound, Rosemary moving fast the way she always moved when she was worried. And behind that, a third set of footsteps, deliberate, measured, the gait of someone who made a profession of being unreadable. Rosemary's voice came immediately, high and fast, already talking. "Mom, opened the door. You don't understand what you're dealing with here." Harriet said nothing. A third voice, lower, controlled, no particular warmth in it. "Mrs. Holloway, we only want to talk." Arabella Radford. Harriet heard her move away from the door, heard the footsteps go around the side of the cabin, heard them pause at each window testing. Then the footsteps went to the back, and the back door handle rattled once. "Locked," Harriet said at normal volume. She was not speaking to anyone in particular. She said it the way you state a fact that does not require argument. The footsteps stopped. Broderick again, closer now, his voice losing some of its practiced evenness. "Mom, please, let us explain." "Broderick." She said his name once, and the way she said it brought a silence from all three of them outside. I know about the disbursements, all of them. I know about the sub-account. I know about Landon's 15%. I know that Arabella found the Tilden office before you knew the trust existed and that she brought you in afterward. She paused. I know that letters were sent to this address for 10 years and that none of them reached me. Nothing from the porch. I know that you filed with a court last Friday to have me declared legally unable to exercise my rights as beneficiary. She let that sit for a moment. 3 days before I received my eviction notice. More silence. Then Broderick, and his voice was different now. The management gone out of it. That's not what it was. Then tell me what it was. No answer came. She could hear all three of them on the porch now. The shuffle of feet, the sound of Broderick moving close to the door again, and then muffled but audible through the thin wall, his voice dropping to speak to the other two. She found the journal. Rosemary, how much does she know? Arabella, lower and harder. If she calls Adrian Tilden before 9 tomorrow morning, we have no legal standing left. None. Harriet looked down at her hands. In them still was the envelope she had found tucked inside the back cover of the journal before she had fallen asleep. She had not opened it yet. She opened it now, standing in the dark cabin with her children and her daughter's husband's wife on the other side of the door, working by the faint glow of the dying coals. Inside, 2 documents. The first was a letter from Tilden and Associates on cream-colored stationery, addressed to Harriet May Holloway, née Ashford, confirming that she was the sole primary beneficiary of the Ezekiel Ashford Family Trust, and that all disbursements made without her express written consent over the preceding 12 years were subject to full legal recovery at her election. The second document was a deed. The cabin, the 47 acres. Every mineral right beneath the surface of that land, all standing in her name, dated 1978, the year Winifred died. Harriet folded both documents back into the envelope and held it against her chest. On the porch, Broderick knocked again, softer this time. Mom, just the word. No management in it anymore. Something else. Something closer to a question than it had ever been when he used that word in recent years. She did not answer him. She walked back to the rocking chair and sat down and pulled the quilt from the arm and settled it across her lap. The cold glow was enough to see by barely. She looked toward the door, and she looked toward the window, and she looked at the clock on the wall. 8:59 in the evening. 9 hours until 9 in the morning. Outside, Broderick stopped knocking. She heard the three of them talking too low now to make out words, and then the sound of feet on porch boards retreating, and then the crunch of gravel. The truck doors opened and closed, but the engine did not start. They were sitting in the truck, waiting. Harriet sat in the rocking chair in the dark and waited with them. She watched the clock, not constantly, not with the frantic attention of someone counting down to a verdict. She watched it the way she had learned to watch monitors during night shifts, a steady peripheral awareness that registered changes without requiring her to stare. The hands moved. The coals in the fireplace faded from orange to a dim and dusty red. Outside, the truck sat in the clearing with its lights off, and from time to time she could see the faint interior glow of a phone screen behind the windshield, and then it would go dark again. She did not sleep. She had slept enough. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she heard the truck's engine turn over. She moved to the window in the dark and watched the headlights come on and sweep the clearing as Broderick backed toward the road. She half expected them to stop, to try one more time. But the truck kept moving, and the lights angled down the grade, and the sound of the engine dropped away through the trees until there was nothing left but the mountain and its silence. She stood at the window for a long time after that. She thought about Winifred, not the Winifred of the journal, Not the Winifred who had made a decision of extraordinary discipline in a loft above this kitchen in the summer of 1961. She thought about the Winifred she had known as a child, the physical presence of her, the way she moved through a room with the quiet authority of someone who had no need to announce herself. Winifred had been a tall woman, thin in the way that outdoor work makes you thin, with hands that were always doing something, shelling beans or mending or turning the pages of whatever book was currently on the table beside her chair. She sang while she cooked. Not songs with words, just melodies low and shapeless and continuous, the sound of a person who is content to be exactly where she is. What Harriet had not understood as a child was the weight her grandmother was carrying while she sang those wordless songs. The knowledge of what was in the tin box, the knowledge of what was growing in the Tilden accounts year by year, unseen, untouched. The knowledge that she was sitting on top of enough money to change the lives of everyone she loved and had made a deliberate choice not to do so. That was not coldness. Harriet understood that now, standing in the dark with the envelope pressed between her hands. Winifred had seen what money done wrong looks like. She had watched it unmake a family from the inside when Ezekiel's brothers turned on each other, and she had absorbed that lesson so completely that it had become a kind of architecture, something she built her entire life around. The love Winifred had for her family was not the kind that rushes to give. It was the kind that waits until giving cannot cause harm. That kind of love requires a patience most people will never have to practice, and a loneliness that comes with it, the loneliness of knowing something important that you cannot share, carrying it through decades of ordinary life, and trusting that eventually the right moment will arrive. The right moment had arrived. It had arrived in the form of a 72-year-old woman with 3 cardboard boxes and a rusted sedan and an iron key she had kept through 4 moves without ever quite being able to explain why. The sky began to change sometime after 4. The black outside the window shifted to something that was not quite dark and not quite light, the particular in-between that comes before the first color of morning shows on the eastern ridgeline. Harriet added the last piece of wood from the stack beside the hearth to the fire and watched it catch. She thought about what she was going to do. Not the legal steps. She already knew the legal steps. She thought about the larger shape of it, the life on the other side of this morning, and she found somewhat to her own surprise that she was not afraid of it. She had spent so many years managing the narrowness of her circumstances, calibrating every decision against what she could and could not afford, that she had forgotten what it felt like to think without that constraint. It felt strange. It felt like stepping into a room that is larger than you expected and having to adjust your sense of where the walls are. She was still sitting in the rocking chair when the first light came through the window. It came as a pale silver line along the top of the ridge to the east, and then it broadened and deepened into a blue that was quilting clear, and then the blue warmed at the edges where the sun was pushing up behind the mountains, and the oak and hickory on the ridge went from black outlines to green, the actual green of living things catching the first real light of the day. She watched it happen the way she had watched it happen from this same window as a child sitting in a different chair at a different time of her life, and she thought that whatever else was true, whatever had been taken from her, and whatever she was about to reclaim this view, had always been exactly this. She got up at 6:30, washed her face in the bathroom sink, made the coffee she found in the cabinet above the stove, the good kind. The kind Winifred had always bought because she said cheap coffee was not a genuine economy, and she sat at the kitchen table with the mug in both hands and waited until the clock said 7. Then she took the envelope and her phone and went out to the Buick. She drove down the mountain slowly, no urgency in it, the Buick taking the switchbacks at a pace that let her look at the trees on either side, the way the morning light came through the canopy, in long, slanted shafts and caught the mist still rising from the lower hollows. She went through Harlan Fork without stopping and kept driving until she reached Crestwood, 40 minutes south, a town large enough to have a main street with actual businesses on it, including a diner with a handwritten sign in the window that said "Open at 6" and meant it. She sat in a booth by the window. The woman who brought her coffee was somewhere in her late 40s with the efficient warmth of someone who has done this job long enough or to read a table accurately in 30 seconds. She looked at Harriet and refilled the mug before he was half empty and said nothing beyond what was needed, and that was exactly right. At 7:52, Harriet set her phone on the table and dialed the number from the Tilden letterhead. 2 rings, then a voice, a woman clear and unhurried. "Tilden and Associates. My name is Harriet Holloway. I'm calling about the Ezekiel Ashford Family Trust. I am the primary beneficiary." A brief silence on the other end. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just heard it arrive. "Mrs. Holloway." The voice changed slightly, became something warmer and more direct. "I'm Adrian Tilden. I've been hoping to hear from you for a very long time." 3 generations of the Tilden family had guarded this trust, each passing it to the next, with the same institutional care that Winifred had trusted from the beginning. Adrian had managed it since her father retired in 2003, and she spoke now with the authority of someone who knew every document in that file by heart. She told Harriet that her office had sent correspondence to the Harlan Fork property every year for 10 years. She told her the letters had never been returned as undeliverable, which meant they had been received at that address, and that her office had concluded someone with access to the property had been collecting and disposing of them. She told her that last Friday her office had received a formal legal petition from an attorney named Arabella Radford, representing a group of family members including Broderick Holloway, Rosemary Holloway Radford, and Landon Ashford Jr., seeking to have Harriet declared legally incapacitated with respect to trust administration and to transfer operational control to Landon Ashford Jr. as existing trustee. The petition was filed, Adrian said, 3 days before your eviction. "I know," Harriet said. "I want to be transparent with you. The timing of that filing taken with the eviction itself suggests a coordinated effort to eliminate your ability to exercise your rights under the trust before you could become aware those rights existed." Harriet looked out to the window of the diner. The morning traffic on Crestwood's Main Street was light. A pickup truck, a woman walking a school bus moving through its route. "What do we need to do?" she asked. "I need you in my office before the petition hearing on Wednesday. I need your identification evidence of your presence at the Harlan Fork property and your signature on the beneficiary claim documents. Once those are filed, the petition has no legal foundation and will be dismissed." "I have a witness," Harriet said. "Yes." "A local man who saw me arrive in Harlan Fork and wrote a dated statement. He's willing to come to Asheville in person." A pause. "That is exactly the kind of corroboration that resolves this cleanly. Mrs. Holloway, I also want you to understand what you're claiming. The primary trust currently holds $2,340,000 after the unauthorized disbursements. The protected subaccount, which has been accumulating all mineral and timber royalty income for 10 years with no withdrawals, holds an additional $990,000. The mineral rights alone generate approximately $87,000 annually. The timber lease generates approximately $12,000. Those payments will continue indefinitely." Harriet sat with the phone against her ear and looked at her coffee cup. "The sub-account," she said. "Winifred set that up specifically because she knew someone might find the main trust." "She did. She told my grandfather in 1978 that she did not trust the emergency clause to hold indefinitely. She said she had enough experience with the Ashford family to know that if there was a door, someone would eventually try to open it, so she built a room that had no door. Harriet closed her eyes for a moment. A room with no door. Winifred Ashford, in the last year of her life, building something she would never see used for a granddaughter who did not yet know she would need it. At a time when Harriet was 34 years old and Harlan was still alive, and the future seemed like something that would sort itself out through ordinary means. "I'll be there Wednesday," Harriet said. She went back to Harlan Fork first. She stopped at Norwood's Feed and Supply and pulled into the gravel lot and went inside. Roscoe was behind the counter, which she was beginning to understand was simply where Roscoe was the fixed point around which the remainder of his world organized itself. He looked at her when she came through the door, and he could read something in her face because he said before she spoke, "You look different than you did yesterday." "I am different than I was yesterday," she said. She told him what she needed. Not everything, not the full accounting of it, just the essential shape. She was going to Asheville on Wednesday to sign documents claiming the trust. There was a legal petition that needed to be countered. She needed him there. Roscoe listened with his hands resting on the counter and his eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got no reason to be anywhere else on Wednesday. I want you to understand it may not be comfortable. There will be attorneys present who are not friendly." "I've dealt with attorneys before," Roscoe said, "during the farm loan troubles in the 80s. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable." He straightened up from the counter. "I'll drive myself. I know the road to Asheville." She started to say something, and he held up one hand not rudely, just clearly. "Don't thank me for this. I'm not doing it as a favor to you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing, and because Winifred Ashford would have wanted someone from Harlan Fork in that room." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. "She would have," she said. She drove back up the mountain one more time, parked in the clearing, walked through the brush to the cabin. The morning was fully arrived now, the light direct and honest across the porch boards. She went inside and built the fire back up because the cabin deserved a fire even when no one was watching, and she sat at the kitchen table and opened the journal to a blank page near the back and wrote with the same short pencil she had used to add up the numbers the night before. She wrote 3 sentences. She did not address them to anyone in particular. She wrote, "I found everything. I understand what you did and why you did it. I will take care of what you built." She closed the journal, left it on the table. Then she went back down the mountain to begin. Wednesday arrived the way important days tend to arrive, not with any particular announcement, just as the next morning after Tuesday. Harriet drove the 3 hours to Asheville with Roscoe's truck visible in her rearview mirror for most of the way, the two of them having agreed to meet at the junction south of Crestwood and convoy down together. She had not asked him to do that. He had simply been there at the junction when she arrived, truck idling, and he had pulled out behind her and stayed there. The offices of Tilden and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a stone building on Oak Street that had been there since 1920, the kind of building that does not try to look important because it does not need to. Adrienne Tilden met them in the reception area. She was a trim, composed woman with short brown hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head in the manner of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where things of consequence were decided and had made peace with the weight of that. She shook Harriet's hand with both of hers. Then she shook Roscoe's hand and thanked him for coming. Roscoe said he was glad to be useful. Adrian showed them into a conference room where the documents were laid out on a long table, and a young associate sat at the far end with a laptop and a professional expression. The documents were substantial: the beneficiary claim form, the deed transfer confirmation, the subaccount release authorization. The formal response to Arabella Radford's petition, which Adrian walked through point by point with the precision of someone who had already rehearsed the argument in her head many times and found it satisfying. Each unauthorized disbursement had been documented in the trust's own records. Each of Landon's signatures was on file. The petition to declare Harriet incapacitated had no supporting medical evidence because there was no medical evidence, only the assertion of people who wanted the trust for themselves and had run out of time to hide that fact. If this goes to the hearing, Adrian said, we will win unambiguously. But I want to give you the opportunity before we file all of this to consider what outcome you actually want. I want the property and the trust transferred entirely to my name, Harriet said. No shared access, no partial arrangements. And regarding the unauthorized disbursements, do you want to pursue recovery? Harriet set her pen down on the table. She had been thinking about this question since she had first seen the numbers in the journal. She had thought about it through the while hours in the rocking chair, while the truck sat in the clearing outside. She had thought about it on the drive south and on the drive back up the mountain and during the quiet of the night before. I want a letter sent to each of them, she said. Broderick, Rosemary, Landon, Arabella. The letter will state that I am now in full possession of the trust and the property, that I am aware of every disbursement and every year in which I was not informed of the trust's existence, and that I have the legal grounds to pursue recovery of the full amount. And then the letter will state that I am choosing not to do so at this time, and that this decision belongs to me alone and is not an invitation for negotiation or further contact. Adrian looked at her over the rim of her glasses. You want them to know you could, but that you're choosing not to. I want them to understand the difference between being forgiven and being managed, Harriet said. I'm not forgiving them. I'm making a decision about my own life, and I want them to be clear about which one of those things this is. Roscoe, who had not spoken during the meeting, looked down at the table in front of him with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. Adrian said she would have the letter drafted by end of day. They signed everything that needed signing. Roscoe signed his witness statement and had it notarized by the young associate at the far end of the table. Adrian filed the response to the petition electronically while they were still in the room, and she showed Harriet the confirmation on her screen, the timestamp, the case number, the notation of receipt. The petition hearing is Thursday morning, Adrian said. I don't expect any difficulty, but I'll call you as soon as it concludes. Harriet looked at the stack of documents in front of her, the top copy of each bearing her signature in the clear, unhurried handwriting she had used for 50 years of medical charts and personal letters and Christmas cards sent to two children who sometimes did not write back. The deed to the cabin, the 47 acres, the trust transfer, the sub-account release. All of it now in her name. She gathered the copies Adrian had set aside for her and put them into the envelope she had brought from the cabin, the same envelope that had held Winifred's letter and the original deed. It seemed right to use the same envelope. A continuity of containers. She and Roscoe ate lunch at a restaurant 2 blocks from the Tilden office, a quiet place with good cornbread and windows that looked out onto the street. They did not talk much. They had both been in rooms where significant things happened, and they both understood that significant things need a little silence afterward to settle properly. At one point, Roscoe said, "What are you going to do with the cabin?" "Live in it," Harriet said. He nodded as though this was the obvious answer, and he had only asked to confirm it. On the drive back to Harlan Fork, she called Gertrude Radford from a gas station, where she had stopped to fill the tank. Gertrude answered after 2 rings. "I found a place," Harriet said. "Good. I won't be coming back to Columbus." A brief pause. "I didn't think you would." Gertrude's voice was warm and direct in the way it always was, the way a person is warm and direct when they have spent enough of their life around children to know that circling around a thing rarely serves anyone. Was it what you needed it to be? It was more than I knew to ask for, Harriet said. Those are the best kind, Gertrude said. The next morning, before Harriet had come down from the mountain, Adrian Tilden called. The hearing had concluded without opposition. The petition was dismissed. The case was closed. Harriet sat in Winifred's rocking chair with the phone in her hand after she hung up and looked through the window. At the ridge, the same ridge she had looked at as a girl, the same green against the same skyline. Some things hold their shape across 60 years. This view was one of them. She drove up to Harlan Fork in the late afternoon, stopped at Roscoe's store one final time. He was locking up for the day when she pulled in, turning the key in the front door, and he turned when he heard the car and waited while she got out. She handed him an envelope. He looked at it without opening it. For the farm, she said. A loan. Same terms as Winifred gave you. He looked at the envelope and then at her. His expression was difficult to read, which she had noticed was his default condition, a face that had learned to keep its own counsel. I don't need it, he said. I know, that's not the point. He stood there for a moment. Then he put the envelope in the pocket of his jacket. I'll pay you back when I have it, he said, and the way he said it told her he knew exactly what he was invoking and that it was deliberate. I know you will, she said. She drove up the mountain in the last of the afternoon light, parked in the clearing, walked through the brush, which caught at her less this time, or perhaps she was simply better at moving through it. She climbed the porch steps and opened the cabin door. The fire was burning. She had come to a kind of peace with this fact. Not an explanation, not a theory, just an acceptance of it as something that was true in this place, something that belonged to this cabin, the way the view from the window belonged to it, and the particular creak of the third porch board belonged to it. Some things do not require mechanism. They only require a willingness to let them be what they are. The water glass on the table was full and cold. The journal sat where she had left it, closed, the leather strap buckled. She did not open it. She set her envelope of documents beside it on the table. She made a simple dinner from what was in the kitchen, which turned out to be more than she expected, someone's careful provision for a guest who was expected. She ate at the table and watched the last light leave the ridge outside the window, the green going dark, the sky going from orange to rose to a deep and cloudless blue. The first stars appeared in the east. She washed her dishes in the sink and dried them and put them away. Then she sat in the rocking chair with the quilt across her lap and the fire burning beside her, and she thought about her children. Not with anger. The anger had been real, and it had done its work, and she had let it shape her decision in the Tilden conference room, and now it was something she could set aside not because it was wrong, but because she was done needing it. Broderick and Rosemary would receive their letters, and they would have to live inside the knowledge of what those letters contained. That was between them and whatever they were able to face about themselves. She was not responsible for managing that process. She had spent a lifetime managing processes she was not actually responsible for, and that was finished. What she felt sitting in Winifred's rocking chair, in Winifred's cabin with the night coming down over the mountain, was something she had not felt in so long that she had to look at it for a while before she could name it. It was not happiness exactly. It was not relief, though relief was part of it. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She felt like a woman who had come to the right place. She had driven 7 hours through fog and trembling hands and 61 years of absence, and she had arrived at the one piece of ground on this earth where someone had thought of her specifically by name and had built something and kept it safe until she could get here. She had not been forgotten. She had never been forgotten. She had simply not known yet that she was being held in someone's mind carefully and with great patience, across a distance of years that most people would not have been willing to sustain. Winifred had sustained it. Winifred had sustained it and then written the record of it down in a journal and left it on the table with the fire going as though she had only stepped outside for a moment and would be back shortly. Harriet reached out and placed her palm flat on the cover of the journal. The leather was warm from the fire's proximity. She kept her hand there for a moment. Then she looked at the window, at the darkness of the mountain pressing up close against the glass, at the stars that were fully out, now more of them than she had seen in years. The kind of sky you only get this far from any city, the kind that reminds you the universe is not small, just because most of what you have been able to see of it has been. She was 72 years old. She had 47 acres of mountain land. She had a trust account and mineral rights in timber contracts and a fire that lit itself. She had a neighbor in the valley below who asked no questions and kept his word. She had a deed with her name on it signed before she needed it by a woman who had loved her in the most difficult possible way, quietly and from a distance and without any guarantee of acknowledgement. She pulled the quilt up and settled into the chair and listened to the fire and the mountain and the night. There was nowhere else she needed to be. There was nothing else she needed to do. For the first time in longer than she could locate in her memory, the morning was not a problem to solve. It was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and she was going to be here when it did, in this chair, in this cabin, on this mountain that had been waiting for her with the lights on. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled once softly. The mountain held its silence the way it held everything, without effort, without end.